House price crash. Is there going to be a house price crash in the UK? We're going to answer this today. How can you benefit from this house price crash? If you're a millennial, maybe you've been priced out of the housing market for so long, and this could be an opportunity of a lifetime. We're going to give away hints, tips, and what you should be doing in a property crash. Why is property price crashing? What does a property price crash look like? We're going to look at past events. We're going to look back to the 1990s. We're going to look back to 2008, and we're going to look into the last year. What could you do to benefit from this crash? So first of all, why is property price crashing? So many banks and building societies have predicted that house prices are going to fall at the end of this year or next year. So prices are already coming off slightly, and potentially next year there's going to be a price crash. Some commentators, some analysts are predicting 20%, 30% crash. This is scary times for a number of house owners who have bought at the top, and potentially you could be going into negative equity. And this means that the amount you pay back, the amount you owe to the bank, is higher than the price of your actual house yourself. So borrowing is increasing, so interest rates are spiking up. We've had a massive period of low interest rates where money has been cheap to borrow, and now the Bank of England have raised prices to 3%. So the interest rates are 3% now. This is good for savers. If you've got money in a bank, you're going to get more money back in interest than you have done previously. So since the financial crash in 2008, there has been really low interest rates, which is basically to encourage growth. The government, or the Bank of England, who is owned by the government, have basically reduced interest rates in 2008 to try and stimulate the economy. And what has happened now since the pandemic, there's been a mass increase in inflation. So the cost of living has increased. You might have noticed this in your gas prices when you put the heating on at night. You might have realised this in the supermarkets when you buy food. You might have noticed this in the cost of petrol when you put the fuel into your car. Its prices have gone up. So you might have noticed this in things getting more expensive, and this is basically created inflation where the cost of living, cost of prices has increased. And basically this means that the price of cost of living has increased, and to stop inflation, the Bank of England, the way to stop the increase of prices is to increase interest rates. So interest rates have gone up to 3%, and this basically means that cost of borrowing. So if you want to borrow money from a bank, this has gone up. The amount of money you have to pay back has increased. So this is bad news if you want to borrow money, because you basically need to pay this back. You have to pay more back of the amount you're borrowing. This is really bad news for buy-to-let owners as well. So if you're a buy-to-let owner, and most of buy-to-let mortgages are short, 2 to 3 years fixed. The amount you can borrow is 2 to 3 years fixed amount. So there's loads of buy-to-let mortgages that are actually coming onto variable rates, which means that it's going to be the 3% or the base rate is going to be affected by the base rate. So if loads of buy-to-let mortgages are basically going to be more expensive, many buy-to-let landlords are going to be selling up, and this is kind of increase the supply of properties. So I used to trade gas, and whenever I used to trade gas, I would ask my manager or the head trader, where's the price going? And he always replied to me, Neil, supply and demand always sets price. So supply and demand, supply and demand, supply and demand. And that's exactly the same with the housing market. So the supply and the demand. And what a lot of commentators miss out in, it's not just supply and demand of housing, it's actually supply and demand of credit. So how much credit is available. So in 2008, what the Bank of England did, or what the government did, is quantitative easing, which is basically printed loads of money. And this increased the supply of money massively. And this meant that it was easier to borrow money. It meant that there was more money swishing around in the system and that banks were much more likely to lend money. So this has been reduced. Interest rates have increased, which meant mortgages are more expensive to pay back, and Help to Buy schemes are coming to an end. So the government, 2008, introduced a Help to Buy scheme, which basically means that they were going to essentially help you to buy. They were going to essentially they were going to guarantee a lot of these lending to new houses, to new build houses. And basically this means that the government would basically guarantee some of these loans. And this means that basically this gave a massive support to the housing market in 2008. So this has meant that basically a lot of millennials have been priced out of the housing market. So with these help to buy schemes coming to an end, this basically means that the supply of money is drying up. So there's less mortgages available. So a lot of mortgages, a lot of banks, a lot of building societies are pulling a lot of offers, and it meant so the supply of money is being reduced, which basically means there's less people able to get mortgages, which means that less people are competing for individual houses. So if you imagine 3 people have mortgages competing for one house, they're much likely to push that price up. So supply and demand of credit and money is going to push prices up. So that was in 2008, but now there's less mortgages available, and so essentially less supply of mortgages competing for these houses, which is going to effectively reduce the price of housing. So another great way to find out where prices are going is if you look at the house builders, the share price of the house builders, and this is what they call a leading indicator. This basically means that the price of house builders, if that drops, the share price of house builders drop. This basically means that the market is not confident that there's going to be enough demand for people building houses in the future. So if house builders drop, and they've been dropping, some house builders have dropped 50%, 40% and 30%. I've got a real good graph that I can actually put in the comments of showing the price of house builders. And if they've dropped, it means that the market is not confident that in the long term, next year or 2023, 2024, the market is not confident that house builders are going to go up in value. So these are not seen to be a good buy in the market. And so the market is not confident that house builders are going up. So there's not going to be a demand for house builders in the future. This is going to reduce the price of houses. So if you look at a number of banks and building societies, what they predict, the Halifax, Nationwide, all of them are predicting house prices to soften in 2022 and 2023. And remember, house builders, banks and building societies, they're always going to be bullish on the housing market. They benefit from a rising house price. So it's very unlikely. It's got to be pretty serious if they're predicting a house reduction. A number of other banks like Credit Suisse, I think, predicted 20% drops. This is kind of crazy price drops in the future. So we've lived through, apart from 2008, we've kind of lived through house prices increasing year on year, and it's always been kind of a safe bet to put your money into property. And this is kind of not going to be the case in 2022, 2023, and potentially 2024 as well. So this is not necessarily a good time to be a homeowner or to be a buy-to-let landlord. But with everything, it's long-term. Like everything, house prices are a market like everything else. So just like the oil market, just like the food market, just like anything else, say the market for books on Amazon, there's always a supply and a demand for these goods. And like every market, there's the demand and supply sets the price. So we've had 10 years of kind of year-on-year growth, and there's kind of the mantra of you can't lose on property. So this is kind of, people think it's a no-brainer and to put money into property, but like everything else, it's a market. There's buyers and sellers, and depending on how many buyers and sellers there are, there's a set price. And we've kind of had a massive growth, and we might have a reduction in prices in the next year or two. And this can be a huge opportunity. So it's not always doom and gloom. We're heading into a recession, and this is not always doom and gloom. If you're watching this, maybe you're a millennial, maybe you've been priced out of the market for 10 years, for 5 years, for a few years. And now this could be a once in a lifetime opportunity where you can actually come in and buy property which is kind of much lower than you would have paid maybe 2-3 years ago. So this is a good thing for maybe a millennial, and maybe baby boomers are selling up because they want to move to nearer the coast. Maybe they want to move to nearer their grandchildren. Maybe baby boomers are selling up because they don't want to live in a city. Maybe they don't want to live in London anymore. It's too busy. It's kind of too polluted. Maybe it's too noisy, and so they're selling up and moving out. So there's lots of opportunity with every market. There's always opportunity, and the way I think of it like if you think of the UK, it's not always, markets don't always move together. They don't always move. They're individual markets. So London might be a very different market to Northern Ireland, for instance. London might be a very different market to Cornwall. So potentially, I think London's going to reduce because it's been such a hot market for so long. It's been kind of boom times. Property prices in London have risen 500% since the 1990s, which is kind of crazy times. So, but there might be other markets like, say, Cornwall or Devon, where people want to be by the coast. People might want a second home. People might want to live kind of more relaxed lifestyle. There might be more opportunities where you can work from home. Now, because of the pandemic, it's kind of opened up where it's much more normal to work from home. So maybe people might want to live and buy on properties by the coast, and they don't want to necessarily live in London because they can work from home 4 or 5 days a week maybe, and maybe they only need to be in the office in 1 day a week or maybe once a month. So that means they don't necessarily need to have the access to be so close to the hot markets that has always been London. So that's another thing. So we're talking about residential property here. So there's 2 types of property. There's residential, which is the roof over your head where people live. Then there's also commercial property. So commercial property could be shopping centres, it could be offices, it could be warehouses, it could be loads of different, basically it's for businesses. And with commercial properties, maybe think of offices. So people don't live, maybe people don't need to be going to the office so often. So with a pandemic, working from home, this is another impact of the pandemic. So maybe the demand for offices isn't as great as it was previously. So maybe just think to yourself, maybe if you're an office worker, maybe you're not going into the office 5 days a week, maybe you're going into the office 2 days a week, and that space, that office isn't being used. That demand is not there anymore. So maybe your employer, maybe they don't need as many desks. Maybe they can reduce the amount of desks, and that's reducing the demand. These are all going to have an impact on the property prices. So maybe that commercial property might turn into a residential property. So I've got property in Bristol that used to be a vet's. That used to be I think it was a vet or a pet shop, but that's now turned from a commercial property to a residential property. We've got someone living there now. So the demand for commercial might not be as high as it once was, and that could turn into residential, and that's going to increase the supply of residential properties when it goes commercial to residential. And that means that there's going to be more beds for people you can maybe potentially rent out or buy. So it all comes back to supply and demand. So let's look at the population. So it's also population. So population growth has been pretty stagnant in the UK. I know if you look at the right-wing press, the Daily Mails of the world, or maybe Fox News, they'll have you think that there's immigrants arriving every day, storming the beaches of Dover, there was, I think the Home Secretary came out this week saying there's been an invasion of migrant workers coming to the UK, which is obviously absolutely ridiculous. But if you look at the data and look at the facts, the population growth in the UK has only increased 0.34%, so 0.34% in 2022 from 2021. So it's barely growing at all. So population actually isn't increasing that much. So that demand is actually not increasing as much as people would think if you read the right-wing press. And also the supply of property is actually increasing. So there's been 38,436 new houses being built in the UK, which isn't that much compared to what the plans were. If you look at some of the plans, what the government was meant to build, it was meant to build hundreds of thousands of new homes, which hasn't been the case. There's a number of reasons for that. Planning permission is quite difficult to get on Greenbelt. There's kind of the NIMBYs, they're not in my back garden. If you have planning permissions, a lot of people kind of don't want people having new builds in their back gardens, so a lot of this planning permission gets rejected. But one thing that's been increasing is extensions. So if you look at extensions or loft conversions, this is increasing massively, especially over lockdown, where people weren't spending money to go out, they weren't commuting costs, and people decided to spend that money in as an extension. So where I've got this here, so the number of Google searches for house extension has never been higher. So more people are extending their houses, more people are getting loft conversions. There's been huge amounts of loft conversion, and this is increasing the supply. So if you've maybe converted your loft to a bedroom, you can rent that bedroom out, and that's going to increase the supply. And as this is a theme of this video, supply and demand sets the price. So the more supply compared to demand, it means the price is going to drop. If there's more demand compared to the supply, price will increase. So it's basic economics. So another thing that's increased is transport links as well. So there's an Elizabeth line in London, which goes all kind of what it used to be called Crossrail. It goes from east to west. And now someone living in Reading can have access to London. So this is basically increased the supply of people. If you want to get into London within an hour, this Crossrail basically means there's more houses or some more supply that you can get into London within an hour. So more supply, less demand means prices are going to drop. So this is kind of the theme of basically that looks like property prices are going to go down in the next year or two. This can be good news. You can snap up a bargain if you have your potentially if you've got your mortgage all set up, then you can go in and look for distressed sellers. So what the best way to get a bargain is look for distressed sellers. Look at the 4 Ds. So debt, divorce, death, and despair. So this is where you're going to get a bargain. So if there is debt, so my first property in Bristol we bought that off a bank. So the bank just wanted to get rid of it because there was the person was in debt and they couldn't repay their mortgage. So essentially the bank repossessed that and then sold that, and they just wanted to get it off their books. And it means you can get a bargain there if you've got, say, death. If someone's died, perhaps the children of that person who dies, if it's an elderly person, they just want to get that house off their hands. This house I'm in at the moment in Oxford, it was someone had died in it, and essentially they sold it to us because that person was an elderly person and they wanted to get it off the books. If they're worried or stressed and they want to essentially just get out of the property market, then you're going to get much more of a bargain than if someone doesn't want to sell. That person is not they're going to kind of negotiate for a higher price. So that's a little tip there. Look for distressed sellers, essentially death, or the 4 Ds we mentioned previously. So supply and demand, it's not just supply and demand of houses, also supply and demand of credit. So in the last house price crash in 2008, there was a massive recession, there was a credit crunch. Banks basically were lending out money where they shouldn't have to people who kind of subprime mortgages, and essentially the government bailed out. The property price would have been a lot more. However, the government bailed out, helped out the house price, basically because it's bad for governments to have the house price crash, because voters don't essentially like, they're not going to vote for you if their house price goes down. So if you think of the current government, it's a Conservative government, most of those voters are elderly people, the boomers, and I think they're homeowners. So the Conservative government can do all they can to reduce the price. They're going to do all they can to stop the house price crash. So what did? They did three things. Essentially, they increased quantity of easing, so they printed loads of money, so that increased the supply of credit, meant more mortgages were available. The Bank of England reduced interest rates, so it was cheap money, it was cheaper to buy, and they had a help to buy scheme as well. So these three things, the Bank of England, who the government owns the Bank of England, essentially those three things, quantity of easing, printing of money, reduced interest rates, and help to buy scheme, where they basically backed up, they basically guaranteed these mortgages, helped keep the house price buoyant in 2008. So it should have been much worse in 2008. London house prices should have been much worse, but the government basically stepped in and bailed out house owners. Is this going to be the same this time? I don't know. We've got a Conservative government here. It feels different. It feels very different this time compared to 2008. So potentially it might be beneficial. If you think of who are going to be, if the government want to win the next election, maybe they want the millennials to vote for them. So they might not bail out the house price as they did before, because they want to have millennials to be house owners. So that's a thought there. So let's think. So potentially, so how could you get benefit of this? So if there is going to be a house price crash, this could be an opportunity. It's not always bad. If you read the papers, they always make this kind of doom and gloom, but this could be an opportunity. If you've got property already, maybe you look to buy another property. Maybe you, I don't know, don't need to live where you work. So if you're in London, and you're thinking, I can never afford where I live. You don't have to buy where you live. You could buy other parts of the country. You could buy other parts of the world. It's higher risk. You've got kind of different contracts, different legal systems if you're buying around the world. But it might be you could pick up a bargain. I bought in Bristol, as I mentioned before, and you get much better value for your money outside of London. So with commuting further, with pandemic, you might be working from home. You don't have to buy in London. You could live somewhere else and commute in maybe one day a week. It might be a bit of a pain to get in. You might have to commute further. But if you're only doing that one day a week rather than 5 days a week, this might not be so bad if you get a bargain. You could start saving up for a deposit. I know the cost of living crisis is increasing, but if you can build up that deposit, that's going to put you in much better stead. You're going to get these much better bargains on your mortgage. The interest rates are 3%. They might go up further, but they might go down in a good few years' time. So thinking about buying later on could be worth saving up for that deposit. And also, so we talked about supply and demand of houses, we talked supply and demand of credit. There's also supply and demand of land. So this is something that no one ever talked about on other YouTube videos. I've never seen this on other YouTube videos. So supply and demand of land. Remember, in the UK, the aristocracy, who's the Queen and kind of the Lords and the kind of dukes and duchesses, they own a third of the United Kingdom, which is crazy. So they own a third of the United Kingdom. And there was a book called Who Owns England, and they looked at real data from there's a data that gets released that anyone can access. It's in the public domain. And basically this book looked at who owns all the land in the UK, and they discovered that a third of the land is owned by aristocracy, which is crazy. So potentially some of that land could be released back, and that's going to increase the supply of land. That's not going to be likely anytime soon, but that will reduce property prices massively. Remember, increasing property prices isn't always a good thing. It's not always a good thing to have increasing property prices, because it means your affordability is it's going to be, and it means it's going to be much lower. People are not going to be able to afford property prices, and the banks and building society, they have a new lending regime. So they look at affordability now compared to what they used to do in 2008. In 2008, you used to have what they called self-certified loans. You would just say on a piece of paper how much you earn, and especially with builders and kind of tradespeople, they would just self-certify their how much they earn, and then the bank would lend that to them, which meant you could basically make it up, and which happened quite often, and they would lend much more than they would do if there's higher checks and balances. So in 2008, there was legislation that came in that basically meant you couldn't do that anymore, and lending restriction is much higher. So it's much higher criteria for banks and building society to lend money, and they look at your affordability, if you can actually pay this back, and they kind of stress test this. I've got a mortgage from this house in Oxford, which I bought with my partner, and they stress test, they looked at our affordability, and with inflation increasing, cost of living, how much you pay on bills, your food prices and petrol prices, that means that people are going to be able to borrow less, because that affordability is going to be less because the cost of living is rising. They look at how much you can afford to have spare. So that's a summary of the house prices. So in summary, I do think the house price is going to crash, probably 10-20%. It all depends on what the government do. So whenever I think about what you can control, what you can't control, so are the government going to come in and kind of bail out house owners? There was things like what they did during the coronavirus, corona crisis, that they did things like they did stamp duty holiday, that's where you didn't pay tax. Are they going to bring in kind of new kind of legislation that's going to bail out house prices? So we don't know that. What about foreign buyers as well? So with the cost of the pound dropping against many other currencies like the dollar and the euro, it makes it much cheaper to buy in the UK. So when the pound drops, it basically means that other currency is stronger, and it means you can get more for your money if you're a foreign buyer. So potentially what also happened in 2008, the pound also dropped at that time, and it meant that foreign buyers came in and bought property, UK property, on the cheap. Is that going to happen again? Maybe. I do think that the UK is not as kind of a quality buy as it once was 10, 20 years ago. We're kind of in a bit of a crisis at the moment. If you look at politics, the kind of leadership, it's a bit of a merry-go-round at the moment. We're not as kind of strong and stable as we once were. So we're not as attractive as potentially we were in 2008. But who knows? Who knows what foreign buyers, maybe that would keep kind of prices high. So I had a question from someone who read my book, Millennial Money Mindset, and they said, should they buy? They've got an opportunity to be buying in January. So basically it depends on what you want. So don't try and time the market. It's about being time in the market. So with house prices, I've made kind of errors where I thought that the price in 2008 was going to go down much lower, and I kind of got caught out because prices dropped and then they kind of spiked up massively again. So buy more because of lifestyle. So if you can, everyone should have a family house. It gives you so much peace of mind that the landlord's not going to kick you out. You can kind of build an extension, you can add value, you can paint, you can add value that way, you can do the gardening, you can actually feel like a real home. You can actually go in the garden and feel kind of the dirt in your hand, and actually it feels kind of, it's coming, that Maslow hierarchy of needs, that kind of pyramid of needs. You kind of have that safe security at the bottom, and you kind of have that esteem and kind of belonging. You can feel part of the community, you can have kind of decorate it to how you like. So I think everyone should aspire to buy their own house. If you can buy with a partner, then you can combine those mortgages and you get more for your money. You can combine those deposits and you get much more for your money. I know it's not everyone can't afford it, but to have a property over the long term, having an asset, a real life asset, a living, breathing asset, is going to go up in price over time. Whereas if you just keep money in a bank, although interest rates are at 3% now, and you might be getting more interest than you previously did, it's still getting long-term. Having money sat in a bank is not going to be as good, or it's not going to generate as much value as if you buy real living, breathing assets like buying property or putting money into the stock market. So don't try and time the market. Do what's right for you. Don't be buying because of you think there's going to be, don't hold off because you think there's going to be a price crash. It's so difficult to time the market. You're trying to predict what millions of people are doing. There's so many different people, government schemes. There's no way that you can predict every time what the property market is going to be like, and each property market is different. The property market in London is so different to the property market in Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales, for instance. So there's all these little property markets that all have their individual supply and demand. So yeah, that's hopefully this video has been useful. My name is Neil Doig. I'm the founder of Money Tips. This is Millennial Money Mindset. You might be watching this on YouTube. You might be listening to this on a podcast. I am live on Money Tips on TikTok. Please join us on Money Tips on TikTok if you want short, snappy videos. Please like, please subscribe, please tell a friend. Please pick up my book, Millennial Money Mindset, if you want the fruit, you need the root. It was shortlisted by the Financial Times. It was an Amazon bestseller. It's one of the best investments you can make into yourself. Just buy a book, buy a £10 book and educate yourself about investing. It's money-wise tops the poll's biggest cause of stress and worry. There's never been so much stress and worry as today about investing and money worries. But education is one way to reduce your stress and worry. Yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully this has been useful. Please like, please subscribe, please tell a friend. Thanks again.